Okay, Sanle Oyasate. Thank you so much, Glenaba and Sharina, for those kind words. Fasan, Gela-san, Sangele, Zoya ha Yuchi Muscogee, Shidane Adene. Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are on this beautiful blue-green planet we call Mother Earth. My name is Dan Wildcat. And yeah, I've been at Haskell a long time now. It shocks me when I realize 38 years. It doesn't seem like that long, but there you have it. And uh, yeah, just delighted to be here with you all, humbled to have this invitation. And so I just kind of wanted to start a conversation about the state of Indigenous education. And I'm going to talk about education big picture, K through 12, post-secondary. And I'll start with, probably not a surprise to anyone, but a couple of the key insights of my dear friend and mentor, the late Vine Deloria Jr. Vine had this great one-liner he would always say about Indian education. He said, the only problem with Indian education is there's no Indians in it. And what he meant by that is that really for, most of all of the 19th century and most of the 20th century, Indian education was the settlers, the colonizers' education for Indians. And, I'm not going to dwell on it because all of you know this. I mean, the history of the boarding schools is pretty much summed up in Richard Henry Pratt's famous motto, kill the Indian to save the man. And that kind of is the way Indian education started, a complete assimilationist process. And so when Vine started thinking about education in the 80s, some of you will remember this. The genesis for his first book on Indian education, which was entitled Indian Education in America, was a series of articles he did for the ACES journal, Winds of Change. So if you Google this, go back and look in, I think the first one may have been late 89, but 89, 90, 91. Deloria did a series of articles for ACES, Winds of Change journal, about Indian education. Norbert Hill at the time was the director of ACES, and Norbert Hill and Vine were friends from way back. And Norbert Hill actually took those essays from Winds of Change and had them published. By the way, if you happen to have a first edition, I think they did a run maybe of 500 or 100 books, a little thin book just titled Indian Education in America. But when Vine started that work, his whole thought process and his whole goal was to suggest, hey, we need to put our intellectual traditions, our cultural traditions, our knowledge and wisdom as the foundation of, quote, Indian education, and then we can rightfully call it Indian education. It won't be the white man's for us, it'll be our education, drawing on our own, metaphysics, knowledges, tribal knowledges, and wisdom. And that was really the goal of his work in the late 80s. That book got published. I think there maybe was a second edition around 95. I met Vine right after I met you, Glenaba. I think the first year I taught at Haskell, I went to the Newberry Library where Glenaba and I met at one of their summer programs at the Newberry Library for Indigenous scholars. And then the next summer, I went to UC Berkeley, where Clara Sue Kidwell put together a program when she was a faculty member at UC Berkeley called Great traditions in American intellectual life and brought in a whole series of people. That's when I met Vine. That must have been the summer of '87. We hit it off right away, started a long correspondence. And anyway, so the '90s, he's doing all this work. And then about 2000, he reached out to me and said, I want to do this book. I want to really flesh out this little book I did. And he said, I want you to write chapters sandwiched in between mine. He said, I don't care what you do. You can elaborate on what I said. You can disagree with what I said. You can, whatever you want to do. I mean, that's how generous he was as a scholar. By the way, he was the best editor I had. But what I was going to write and what I wanted to address, completely yours. He said, I trust you. Just sandwich your commentary and it'd be like a discussion. So that's how Power in Place, Indian education came into being. And there were a couple of things there that are really important for us to remember. So one, what was the goal of the book? It wasn't a curriculum guide. It was never meant to be a curriculum guide, tell you what your lesson plan should look like or what you should put in your lesson plans. What it was this attempt to say, let's frame our education with indigenous philosophy. So I think the legacy of Vine's thinking now is that we have across the country in various places, schools serving our children that are really trying to do that, what I will call indigenized education. So what I'd like to do is give you kind of a brief sketch of what our thinking about that was and some of the problems and challenges, and then open it up for a discussion. That's where the real learning occurs, right? So, and your questions. So, I always say when I do a presentation like this, I'm going to speak to you all as a relative. And that means I'm going to be honest, maybe not right, but I'll be honest. If I'm wrong, I'll be honestly wrong, okay? And you'll be good relatives and correct me, right? Because you'd be a bad relative if you didn't. So I welcome criticisms and questions and maybe disagreements, but that's what we need, in the academy. So the first thing I'd begin with is the principle of humility. I think one of the things that we need to really inculcate in our upcoming Indigenous educators is the attitude of humility. I think that's really lacking in higher education, where professors often think they have to know it all or pretend they know it all and never say, I don't know. I don't have the answer. Let me get back with you. Humility is such an important part of our own intellectual traditions. I can't name everyone who I've heard essentially say things like this, Albert Whitehat, Sinte Gillespie University, Henrietta Mann, our Cheyenne elder and educator, but so many educators, Indigenous educators, I always hear them begin with that kind of acknowledgement that, hey, don't know it all. This is what I know. I'll share it, but there's probably a lot more than what I've laid out. And I like that attitude. So I'm going to speak to you as a relative, and that way, if I'm wrong, I'll be honestly so, okay? I'm just going to speak honestly. So my thinking right now, and that's why I did the book Indigenuity, Learning the Lessons of Mother Earth, is that the biggest challenge we have right now, folks, is we have to disabuse the general public, and often many of our colleagues in the universities and colleges where we work, that when we talk about indigenous knowledge and TEK, we're not talking about the past. We're not talking about something that was dead and was done by our ancestors. We are talking about living knowledges and intellectual traditions. We are talking about practices. We are talking about a way of life. If we can get that across, that is a tremendous victory, because I can guarantee you there's not any major public institution of higher education, where you won't find people who think, oh, well, I just love learning about Indians. In fact, I took my grandchildren to the museum the other day. What? You took them to the museum. Why didn't you take them, over to visit a community, over to see, a living people, a living place? So I think this is still one of our major challenges. And I think even sometimes teachers with the best intent, when they incorporate indigenous material into their classrooms, they talk about us in the past tense. They don't acknowledge the fact that we are living, that we are right here. The idea of indigenuity, indigenous ingenuity, is this idea of, hey, our intellectual cultural traditions are living. Do they change? Yes, they change. The world is changing now. We are very aware of that. Do we have parts that remain unchanged? Yes, but we also change and adapt and innovate and create because we are living peoples and our cultures are living. So I think this is one big kind of overview I'd like to offer of the challenges we have in education, K through 12, post-secondary. What does it mean to indigenize our education? So we'll again build off. I've done a lot of my work just building off and trying to, extend Vine Deloria's work. So in chapter 3 in Power and Place, some of you will remember he's got this marvelous short chapter where he says, the basic axiom of American Indian metaphysics is real simple. I call it the 3P axiom. Power plus place equals personality. And he really meant this is the basic foundation. If you can understand that in some of its depth, you begin to understand something about the uniqueness, the diversity, the particularity of our tribal identities. So let's start with power. Deloria wasn't talking about economic power, political power, or the things that so many people seem hell-bent on trying to get today. Talking about power in a very metaphysical sense, the power that makes up the entire cosmos. There is no empty place in space. Even darkest space, we now know, has these nano particles of chemical elements, these infinitesimally small particles. They're full there. They can transmit energy. You can go in the deepest space, and if you have your sun panels arranged in the right way, you can power, these space devices into deep space. No such thing as empty space for Deloria. The cosmos was full of power. Is it intangible? Can we see it? Not always. Often it's intangible, but it's not hard to believe. We can't see the air we breathe, and yet we all know that we'd be dead in 4, 5, 6 minutes if we couldn't take that breath of life. So power, he said, that's the first principle I want people to understand. Place. This is where Deloria's genius, I think, really comes through. He said, place is the Four Corners area, Second Mesa, in Arizona, the Everglades in Florida. Different places, different peoples, and those places really have a unique power just because they're different. They're in different places. So we're channeling all this energy, and its focal point is in a unique place. Power plus place is what makes us different. It's why, Nanaba's people are very different than my Zoyaha people. Look at where we came from. My people were in earliest times along the Savannah River in Georgia. Very different than, those that Denata in Arizona and New Mexico, that land between the four sacred mountains that, people might think, if they were Dene, the people of the Pueblos along the river, different places. And Deloria thought this was the key insight. Every place, every people is different. Hence, power plus place equals personality. And you might think of personality as our individual personality, and then you might think of it as indigenous peoples with our unique relationship to places as our cultures. That's why we have different cultures. We are different constellations of this power in the universe. I think it's a beautiful idea. I think it sounds, if you think about it, it starts to really resonate with a lot of things that we understand in our own indigenous traditions. So I've been making the argument, since most of my work is now working with scientists, both indigenous scientists and non-indigenous scientists, that the key principle of indigenizing our education is get young students to understand the deep relationality that their existence is a part of. The relationship to the land, the relationship to the air, relationship to the water, relationship to their human relatives, but most importantly, relationship, or just as important, I won't say most importantly, but just as importantly, our relationship to the different than human relatives we have, the plants, the animals, the land, the air, the water. Our peoples represent that in our culture. That's why they're unique. We're not all in the same place. We're in different places. And those places define the kind of, when I use with my students, I talk about constellations. So you can think of yourself as a constellation. You are somewhere in the middle of a constellation that is all of those relationships you've had from that moment you took this form as a human being to the time when we leave this world. But during that time, you're in constellations, relationships of power with human relatives, with different than human persons, with your human relatives. All of these things make up, who we are. Think of what you could do with that in psychology, in sociology, in physical science, in environmental science. I think this is what Deloria was striving for, is to say, we don't need to go back and use Aristotle's idea, of disciplines. We're all a part of the time now where all we hear in the academy is, oh, we've got to get out of our silos. We've got to get out of our silos. Oh, we can't think in boxes anymore. We've got to be interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. Well, I got news for you, folks. That was never a problem for my people. We never worked in silos and we never thought in boxes. We thought about ourselves in terms of these complex relationships we have. That should be how we start thinking about what it means to build Indigenous education. Now, this won't be a surprise to Sharina. She could probably give you some of this lecture herself. She's probably heard it many times. But the best classroom we have remains the out of doors. Indigenizing education means getting our kids out of doors so that they can learn about those relationships. I think there's so much that we could do in science education with this kind of indigenous model of education where, you don't have to teach about the soil in a classroom. Take them outside, let them get their hands dirty, let them collect samples, let them take those back in and use, the tools of modern science, the microscopes and analytic tools to study that soil. But I think this is something that we have really lost. We've lost a sense in which we think of education as not being a part of the world around us. I know many of you, I'm probably speaking to the church choir, as my maternal grandmother would have said. You probably nodding your head in agreement. Well, I hope you are. But if this is news to you, I think it's worth considering. And that is that I think the way that we indigenize education is go back to that notion. Power plus place equals personality. Make the learning that students are doing relevant to the place where they live, to who they are as an Indigenous person. Now, this gets complicated because many of our relatives, our tribal relatives, aren't living basically, on their reservations or their homelands. They're living in Albuquerque, Phoenix, Denver, Oklahoma City. That's true. And I think this raises an issue of how we, address, this kind of diaspora that many of our people have experienced, sometimes not of their own choosing, but relocation programs of the Bureau and whatever. That raises some questions about how you talk about this relationship between a people and a place for people who are no longer maybe living in the place, which gave them their identity, but it certainly doesn't, we shouldn't think of that as precluding the idea that no matter where you are, you should have some sense of this deep relationality that we are a part of. In fact, Vine used to say, our communities in our tribal traditions were not just human communities, they were ecological kinship communities. That really our communities included the plants, the animals, the land we were on, the water, the wind. In some traditions, the sun and the moon. And the Zoyaha are, we call ourselves the children of the sun. And so we are very much, thinking about that relationship we have on this beautiful Mother Earth with the sun. So power plus place equals personality. And I want to give some examples. You can do this with any. It used to happen in public schools. That's been a long time since I've been in, elementary school or junior high or high school. But for me, in 7th grade, it was when they taught first geography lesson. We learned geography of the United States. That's when I learned about the Great Plains, the wetlands of the Southeast, the desert Southwest, the Northwest coast, the Great Lakes, New England, the northeastern part of the United States. And what do you learn? All the kids learn, well, these are very different places. New England's nothing like Arizona and New Mexico. Arizona and New Mexico are nothing like Oregon and Washington. And then what would follow up on that was an understanding then that the buildings that people lived in, the clothes they wore, the diets they had in earlier times all reflected that place. In my work, some of you who are familiar with it know I'm real fond of using this notion of the nature-culture nexus. In our traditions, my tradition, the Zoyaha traditions, we never had this question of is it nature or culture, because we never realized that you could separate the two. Our identity was given to us by the place where we came into being. That nature-culture nexus defined that relationship, defined who we are as peoples. Now, in 7th grade, when you teach geography, back in the day, I don't know when they do it now, you could teach that lesson. Yeah, those Indians of the Pacific Northwest, they didn't have bison ceremonies. They had salmon ceremonies. Our friends, our Pueblo people, Apache, Hopi, Dene, they did not have salmon ceremonies. They had ceremonies around the corn. as my people did as you went across the United States. Our most important ceremony is the green corn ceremony. So, and you can tell a seventh grader this, and they'll go, well, of course. You'd have to be nuts to think that the people down in Arizona were having, salmon ceremonies, and that, everyone had relationships with the place that they lived that defined their material culture, their religion, ceremonies. And I think this is something that we need to really hone in on as we do indigenous education today. It's about this symbiotic relationship between nature and culture. It's about people and places and how those places gave people their identities. You can do illustration after illustration about this. And then we can come to that problematic discussion we need to have. In fact, we're just working on a final exam in one of my courses today. I always ask students to contribute 2 questions, 2 dream questions that they've thought of, that they'd like to write about on my final exam. So I give them a series of questions. Most of them are mine, but I usually try to put 2 of their questions on there. What are you interested in? I had this great question today from a young woman, and this is what essentially she wrote. She said, my question is, we've just got through reading a book by Calvin Martin, non-native man, who has tried to reflect in his work the way of the human being. Anyone here familiar with that book? Show of hands, anyone? Okay, take a look at it. Okay, I see one hand went up. Okay, take a look at it. It's an interesting book. But she wrote a fascinating question, and what her question was, he has this great story about the puffin that his Alaska native friends gave him, and the story goes like, the puffin knows who he is. The puffin knows his home, and the stories about the puffin and their relationship to place and to human people. And her question that the students decided to put it on the final exam. They liked it so much. They said, the puffin knows who he is, but do we know who we are today? How many of us have heard from our children that one of the biggest challenges they face is trying to sort out what it means to be Pueblo or Apache or Lakota or any tribal member today, because society is constantly foisting upon them false images, false stereotypes of what it means to be Native, and they get confused. And she wrote this really great question for our final exam, and it was about identity, and said, the puffin knows who he is. Do we know who we are? And what happens if we don't live in our place of emergence or our place of of creation, where our stories tell us we became people? How do we maintain that relationship? This is an important question, and something that we ought to think about and talk about with children, with our students. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions. The 3 quick points I'd summarize this with is, I think we've got to disabuse people of the fact that when they talk about indigenous knowledge and wisdom and culture, that all the questions they have can be answered at the museum. We still got a lot of people who think, oh, they'll just go to the museum and look at the exhibits and then they'll know about Native people. I don't think so. Second point, let's think seriously about how we could apply Deloria's axiom for basic metaphysics, power plus place equals personality, to really think about identity issues today and our deeper human relationship, with the balance of life on the planet. And if we do that, then I think many of you will know, and I'm not going to say all, anyone who makes a claim about all natives, you can just turn them off immediately because no one knows about all Native people. There are too many of us, we're too diverse. And so if they start their conversation as an expert on Indigenous people, you can walk out of the room early because there is no such thing, okay? There are too many of us. They're too diverse. So we just each know a little bit, right? And so the last point I would draw on, based on those first two, is my work with climate change has really made me think that we need young Indigenous scientists more than ever. We need scientists, engineers, biologists, chemists, geologists. We need entrepreneurs who understand that we don't live in a world full of natural resources. In my Zoya Ha tradition, and I think some of your traditions, you live in a world full of natural relatives. I don't think that's indigenous romanticism. I call that indigenous realism. And we need a good dose of it right now, folks, because I think if Einstein was right in that apocryphal quote attributed to him that you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them, man, we need indigenous thinkers right now. And I think that's what we can take on as a good part of our work. I'll stop there. Love to hear questions.